Before we start today's video, we would really appreciate it if you could hit the subscribe button. With your support, we will continue to produce more true crime content. Thank you for watching. We need to talk about Dennis. Dennis Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, Aberdeenshire, Scotland. Nilsen was one of 3 siblings. His father, Olaf, was frequently absent until one day when he abandoned his family for good, forcing Dennis, his siblings, and his mother, Betty, to move in with her parents. When she remarried, Dennis remained with his grandparents for a while before moving back with her. Dennis described his upbringing as loveless, with him being particularly jealous of the affection displayed to his siblings, and later, his step-siblings. He found a new father figure in his grandfather and was particularly knocked when he passed away. Nilsen was only 5 years old when his grandfather died, so not old enough to understand everything that was happening to him. His grandfather's body was also returned to their family home for Dennis and his family to say goodbyes, where he stated that his mother failed to explain death to him by telling him that his grandfather was just sleeping. It's been mentioned that this is where Dennis's obsession with dead bodies began. Dennis also mentioned that his precipitating trauma was what led him on his path to destruction. At 8 years old, Dennis experienced another extremely traumatic event. Dennis was walking along a local beach when the tide caught him and pulled him out to sea. He nearly drowned and would have if not for an older boy who rescued him. He was always referred to as shy and an introverted teen. Like many other serial killers, Dennis was above average when it came to his academics. It's said that his favorite subjects were art and history. When he finished high school at 14 years old, he joined the Army Catering Corps and served all over the world, including Aden, Cyprus, and Berlin. He was a part of the British Army until the 1970s when he retired as corporal. During his time in the military, Dennis became increasingly aware of his own sexual urges, to the point where he felt he had to bathe separately from other men to control himself. After retirement from his illustrious military career, Dennis then joined the Metropolitan Police in London as a cadet, then as a security guard, and then working in a job center. Dennis was a closeted gay man throughout his life, but during the 1970s, his urges to be with men became all-consuming. He was a sexually repressed and lonely man, desperate for connection and acceptance. It was at this time that he developed a dependence on alcohol and frequently visited gay bars. This unfortunately did nothing to help him with self-acceptance. He also found it unhelpful because he was looking for a monogamous relationship. Worrying behavior was starting to rear its ugly head around the mid-1970s. In 1973, Dennis met a young man called David Painter whilst at work. David claimed that Dennis had been breaching his privacy and making him uncomfortable by taking pictures of him whilst he was sleeping. This resulted in Dennis being taken into the station for questioning, but unfortunately was released without being charged. By the time 1978 rolled around, Dennis had 3 failed relationships and was deeply unhappy in his life. Desperate for a long-term relationship, his mental health was at an all-time low. Around this time, he began acting on his urges in the unhealthiest of ways. Dennis began to murder, dismember, and fraternize with the corpses of young men that he found in London. The first victim of Dennis's wrath was Stephen Holmes, a 14-year-old boy. Stephen was trying to get alcohol from a pub in London on December 30th, 1978. Dennis saw an opportunity and invited Stephen back to his home, and they drank together all night. The next morning, when Stephen attempted to leave, he was strangled to death by Dennis. Dennis then burned his corpse. On October 11th, 1979, Dennis felt his murderous urge once more. After another night out, Dennis met Andrew Ho, a student. Dennis invited Andrew back to his house to engage in sexual relations. Once there, Dennis attempted to strangle Andrew, just as he had done with Stephen Holmes. Luckily, Andrew managed to escape, but never pressed charges against Dennis. 2 months after Dennis's attempt on Andrew Ho's life, Dennis found his next victim. On December 3, 1979, he met a Canadian student called Kenneth Ockenden. He was in the United Kingdom visiting his relatives. Playing to the tourist in Kenneth, Dennis offered to help him explore London's landmarks. After their travels, Dennis offered Kenneth more drinks and a meal back at his house, 195 Melrose Avenue. They spent the evening drinking before Dennis strangled Kenneth to death with the cord of the headphones he was listening to music with. After the murder, Dennis coldly poured himself another rum and listened to the music through the headphones he'd just brutally strangled Kenneth with. The day after Kenneth Ockenden's murder, Dennis purchased a Polaroid camera specifically for photographing his victims. Once back at Melrose Avenue, Nilsen posed Kenneth's body in numerous provocative positions and captured them with the camera. After the murders of Andrew and Stephen, Dennis picked up a Canadian student, Martin Duffy. Martin had been homeless on the streets of London for a few days. He was hungry and tired when Dennis set his sights on him. Nilsen offered the young man a bed and a meal for the night. As Martin slept in the bed, Dennis made a ligature and strangled Martin until he was unconscious. Once unconscious, Dennis dragged Martin to a sink and drowned him. After this brutality, Dennis washed Martin's body. Dennis's behavior after each murder was so ritualistic. He would wash the bodies and keep them either on the couch near him, in a cupboard, or in his bed until they started showing signs of bloating. Once they were starting to bloat and smell, he would remove their organs and wrap them in plastic and put them under his floorboards. He frequently pulled them out from under the floor when he was desperate for company, often sitting with them to drink and watch television. Before the end of 1980, Dennis had claimed 5 more victims, 4 of which remain unidentified to this day. The only victim to be identified in this period was William Sutherland, a 26-year-old man. When Dennis was confessing about these victims, he couldn't recall any specifics to aid the police in identifying them, but he went into explicit detail about the murders themselves. He also mentioned to the police that he attempted to resuscitate one of these victims, but failed. He claimed that this caused him great emotional distress, to the point of sobbing and spitting at his own reflection. Obviously, when you have a number of corpses underneath your floorboards, there's bound to be foul odors and insects that accumulate. This forced Dennis to remove the bodies, dissect them, and form a bonfire in the space behind his flat. To dispose of the bodies, Dennis would burn them with tire parts to disguise the putrid smell of flesh burning. He would then rake over the ashes to ensure there were no obvious bone fragments, noting that there was a fully formed skull that he smashed with a rake. Dennis went on to take the lives of 3 more victims between January and April 1981, all remaining unidentified. In the months following these murders, Dennis would dissect the bodies and dispose of their organs in the household waste and in the waste ground under the flat. Malcolm Barlow, a 23-year-old, was the final victim to be murdered at 195 Melrose Avenue. Malcolm was suffering from side effects of his epilepsy medication when Dennis found him propped up against a wall. In a rare act of kindness, Nilsen escorted Malcolm back to his flat and called an ambulance. Malcolm returned to Melrose Avenue after being discharged from the hospital to thank Nilsen. This, sadly, would be the last thing he ever did. Dennis Nilsen was forced to vacate 195 Melrose Gardens in the middle of 1981, as his landlord was about to renovate the flat. Before leaving the flat, Dennis dissected and burned all the remaining bodies. He relocated to 23 Cranley Gardens, an attic flat with no access to a garden. As he couldn't store any bodies under his floorboards, Dennis almost managed 2 months without committing murder. He still had visitors in this time and did attempt to strangle Paul Nobbs, a 19-year-old student, but didn't allow himself to go all the way. Nilsen met John Hallett, a 23-year-old near Leicester Square, during a night on the town. Nilsen enticed John back to Cranley Gardens with the promise of more booze. They drank and watched a movie until John fell asleep on Nilsen's bed. John was awoken by Nilsen attempting to strangle him to death. He put up a courageous struggle, even managing to strangle his own attacker. Unfortunately, Dennis was able to regain the upper hand and strangle John to unconsciousness. Shocked at the fight that John gave him, Dennis left the room and decided he would drown John in the bathtub. The evidence of this fight was worn on Dennis's neck for the next week. On another night of drinking, Nilsen approached 21-year-old Carl Stoddart at the Black Cape pub in Camden. Carl was drowning his sorrows following a breakup when Dennis enticed him back to his flat for more drinks, promising him that he had no sexual intentions. Like his usual MO, Dennis drank with Carl until Carl fell asleep. At this point, Dennis went on to strangle him. Carl, in and out of consciousness, believed that Dennis was trying to free him from the zip of the sleeping bag. Dennis had less than innocent intentions. He strangled him into unconsciousness and then attempted to drown Carl in his bath. Carl awoke once more whilst Dennis was drowning him, begging him to stop. Dennis carried on, believing that he had killed Carl, but the youth hung on to life. Dennis only realized that he was still alive when his dog was licking the boy's face. Dennis then nursed the young man back to health over the next few days, insisting that he had rescued him from being strangled by the sleeping bag. When asked why he was in the water, Dennis proclaimed that he was in shock. After a few days, Dennis escorted Carl to a local train station. Carl had survived the monster. In September of 1982, Dennis murdered 27-year-old Graham Allen. Dennis kept Graham's body submerged in his bath for a number of days before dissecting his body on the kitchen floor. On January 26, 1983, Dennis committed his final murder. Stephen Sinclair had the misfortune of meeting Nilsen near the tube station. Like usual, Dennis piled Stephen with alcohol when he was already inebriated from earlier drug use. As Nilsen strangled Stephen with a rope and necktie, he noticed that Stephen had recently attempted suicide. Nilsen laid Stephen's body on his bed, surrounded by 3 mirrors. Here he laid with the body and performed intimate acts with him. He then dissected the body and wrapped various dismembered body parts. He stored these body parts around his house, in a cupboard near the bath, a wardrobe, and a tea chest. He disposed of Stephen's organs and smaller bones by flushing them down his toilet. Investigation. On February 4th, 1983, Dennis filed a complaint to his estate agents about the drains being clogged. He insisted that the situation was intolerable for both himself and the other tenants in the building. He complained about a situation that he had caused with his murderous deeds. Dennis's exploits were first discovered by an emergency drainage employer, Michael Cadran, when he responded to Nilsen and the other tenants' plumbing complaints at Cranley Gardens on February 8, 1983. Upon opening the drain at the side of the house, Michael found that the drain was blocked by flesh-like materials and small bone fragments. He then reported to his supervisor, Gary Wheeler.
What did you find?
A mass of flesh, shall we say.
Due to them arriving on site in the evening, they delayed any further investigations into the blockage until the next day. Early the next day, they returned to Cranley Gardens, and the drain they were due to investigate had since been cleared, making both men very suspicious. Luckily, they discovered more of the bodily matter in a pipe above the drain, which linked up to the top floor flat, Nilsen's flat. They then immediately contacted the police. When the police arrived on site, they discovered more bone fragments that appeared to be either human or animal origin. This matter was then forwarded to a pathologist in Hornsey called David Bowen, who identified the bones to be of human origin. He was also able to tell that one of the bones were from a human neck. The police then discover how the pipe links back to Nilsen's flat, leading them straight to him. They waited outside the building for Nilsen to return home from work. When he finally returned home, Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. and 2 of his colleagues explained that they had come to inspect the drains, to which Nilsen asked if they were health inspectors. He was informed that they were all police, and he asked why they were interested in the drains. As they expressed they needed access to Dennis's flat, They followed him up to the floor it was located. They immediately noted the stench of rotting flesh. Dennis kept asking them why they needed access to his flat to investigate the drains, to which the police informed him about the human remains. He faked concern and shock. DCIJ recognized the fakeness of Nilsen and cut straight to the point, asking where the rest of the body could be found. Dennis was calm and collected as he admitted the rest of the body would be found in plastic bags near his wardrobe. The smell of decomposing flesh was overwhelming. They then asked Nilsen if there were other bodies to be found, to which Nilsen responded, "It's a long story, and he would be happy to discuss it all at the police station." They then arrested him and placed him under caution for murder, transporting him back to Hornsey Police Station. On the journey, the police kept questioning Nilsen, asking if the remains were that of one or two people, greatly underestimating just how sick he was. Nilsen revealed that the parts belonged to at least 15 people, dating back to 1978. That same evening, DCIJ was accompanied by Detective Superintendent Chambers back to Cranley Gardens to further investigate the drains in Dennis's flat. They removed the 2 plastic bags from the property and transported it to the Hornsey mortuary. In one of the plastic bags, they discovered the 2 dissected torsos and a grocery bag filled with internal organs. In the second bag, there was a human skull, completely stripped of its flesh, a severed head and arms attached to another torso, and both hands were missing. It appeared that both heads had been boiled. On February 10th, Dennis confessed to having more body parts scattered around his flat. They found more remains in a tea chest and a drawer in his bathroom. This was also when he admitted to murdering at least 10 other men. On this same day, the police escorted Dennis back to Melrose Avenue. Whilst there, he identifies numerous locations in the backyard where he had burned remains. In Britain, the law for criminals means that they need to charge the culprit within 48 hours of the arrest. Luckily, the mortician was able to piece together some of the remains. Upon doing this, they were able to identify the body as Stephen Sinclair. On February 11th, the police formally charged Nilsen with the murder of Stephen. That same evening, they began to formally question Nilsen, and he was offered representation from a solicitor, which he accepted. Questioning Dennis took over 30 hours. Nilsen couldn't give the police a motive for the murders and was resolute in his defense that he hadn't premeditated these murders, that they happened spur of the moment. When asked why Dennis would boil his victims' skulls, he stated that it would melt away any of the skin and organ fibers, meaning that they wouldn't decompose and he could keep them. During the questioning, Dennis was asked if he felt any remorse for the murders, to which he stated that he wished he could stop, but that he had no other happiness in his life. He also said that he took no pleasures from the murders themselves. Trial. After Dennis was formally charged, he was transferred to Her Majesty's Prison in Brixton to be held on remand until going to trial. His time here was not that of peaceful reflection. Dennis would frequently protest his rights on not having to wear the prison uniform. He also threw the contents of his chamber pot at some of the prison guards, resulting in him being found guilty of assaulting an officer and being forced into solitary confinement. On May 26th, Dennis had to stand trial for 5 murders and 2 attempted murders at the Old Bailey. They later added the 6th murder charge to this. Nilsen's original plan was to plead guilty to each of the murder charges. However, 5 weeks before the trial, Dennis changed his legal representation and was then advised to plead not guilty due to diminished responsibility. Dennis Nilsen's trial began on October 24th, 1984. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. The main argument between the prosecution and the defense was whether Dennis's state of mind was sound during the killings. They also wanted to decide on whether he had premeditated the murders. His defense argued that Dennis was not sane in his decision to commit murder and should only be charged with manslaughter. The case was opened by the prosecution outlining the events that took place in February 1983, including the identification of body parts and remains in the drains at Cranley Gardens, then how they found more dismembered remains at Nilsen's flat. They moved on to his confession, and how Dennis himself led the detectives to burnt remains in the backyard of Melrose Avenue. They had a number of Nilsen surviving victims take the witness stand, including Douglas Stewart, a young man who woke up tied to a chair in Dennis's flat. He was lucky enough to overpower Dennis and escape. After Douglas escaped Dennis's flat, he reported the incident to the local police, who questioned Dennis but took this as a lover's quarrel. Nilsen's defense did their best to damn Douglas's credibility, using the fact that he had already sold this story to the press and the fact that he had consumed alcohol on the night in question to make the jury see him as a liar. Next to the stand was Paul Nobbs, a university student. His testimony was used by the prosecution to prove Dennis's self-control when it came to his homicidal impulses. Paul never reported his experience with Nilsen to the police for fear of his sexuality being outed. The defense took the fact that Paul was a university student to dispute the prosecution's argument that Dennis only chose people with no family or homes and were unlikely to be missed. Finally, Carl Stoddard told the court his story of how Nilsen had strangled him and tried to drown him before bringing him back to life. This was obviously a very traumatic and emotional experience for Carl. After the witnesses shared their accounts, DCIJ explained the circumstances that led to Nilsen's arrest, explaining to the jury how calm Dennis was through the whole process. He also shared a number of Dennis's statements with the jury, one of which Dennis expressed how he has no tears for his victims or those bereaved by his actions. He also made it clear to the court that Nilsen had provided most of the evidence himself, to the extent that he was extremely forthcoming and even showed the police exactly where to find the remains. To accompany DCIJ's statement, Detective Superintendent Chambers read Dennis's confession to the court, reciting his own gruesome details of the ritualistic murders and how he stored and dismembered the bodies. It was clear that this rocked the whole court, with the jury looking shocked and shaken. Everyone was visibly emotional apart from Dennis. He showed no emotion at all. The witness and the police testimonies lasted until the next morning, after the prosecution shared the evidence with the court, including the cooking pot that he had used to boil the victims' skulls, a cutting board that he had used to dismember some of the bodies, and some rusty knives that had belonged to Martin Duffy, one of his victims. Dennis's defense called two psychiatrists to the stand to express that because of Dennis's emotional difficulties, his lack of emotions other than anger, and his ability to see people not as people, but just as part of his own fantasies, he could be found innocent of the crimes by reason of insanity. They expressed that they believed that Dennis was suffering from an unidentified personality disorder and showed narcissistic traits. They also believed that his unidentified personality disorder was severe enough to reduce his responsibility for the crimes, linking back to their argument about him being innocent due to mental illness. The prosecution then called Paul Bowden to the stand to dismiss the psychiatrist's theories. Paul had spent numerous hours interviewing Nilsen prior to the trial and was able to share with the court that Nilsen, although a little odd, did not have a personality disorder. He argued that Nilsen was a manipulative person that would force himself to objectify people. Thus, he was not the slave to some disorder, as they had previously stated. After the closing arguments from both the prosecution and defense, the jury retired to make their verdict. It took them a matter of hours to return with a majority verdict the following morning. They had found him guilty on all 6 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. In regards to Paul Nobbs, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 25 years to serve. Once sentenced, he was transferred to Her Majesty's Prison, Wormwood Scrubs, as a Category A prisoner, meaning that he was given his own cell. Mixing with the other inmates wasn't always pleasant for Dennis. On one occasion, he was assaulted by another prisoner. In December 1994, Nilsen's life sentence was updated to be a whole life tariff instead of at least 25 years. This meant he would never leave the prison. On May 10, 2018, Dennis was moved from Her Majesty's Prison Full Sutton, a prison he had been transferred to years earlier, to York Hospital due to severe stomach pains. They discovered that Dennis was suffering from a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. They were able to repair this, but he suffered from a blood clot after the surgery. At the age of 73, Dennis died of a pulmonary embolism and a retroperitoneal hemorrhage. He was cremated and had a service with 5 people in attendance, and his ashes were handed to his family. Dennis Nilsen is remembered as one of the most prolific serial killers in British history. In the duration of his murders, it's believed that Dennis claimed between 12 and 15 victims. Cut. If you liked our video, please hit the subscribe button for more true crime content. Thank you for watching.